long time ago, someone by the name of Spooky Scary Socialist made a YouTube video called Debunking Every Anti-Communist Argument Ever. As expected from a socialist, his video is essentially complete garbage, either poorly addressing the argument, framing the arguments poorly, or choosing to address poor anti-communist arguments to begin with. That I can't really fault him for because they could be common, but still, nonetheless. Ubersoy, who I mentioned in my first video, made a great response to Spooky Scary Socialist, which will be linked below. When I googled debunking every anti-capitalist argument ever, nothing came up, so I figure it's probably a good idea to make a video addressing those anti-capitalist arguments. I can't address everything, but I'll do my best to address the most common ones. The video is sorted into 5 sections, not counting this brief intro and the conclusion. The basics, the left, the center, the right, and the economists. The basics is the only portion that doesn't address any counter-arguments, as it describes the a priori truths that economics is derived from and the effects of those fundamental truths. The other 4 sections address each counter-argument that I perceive best belong to that group. For example, capitalism exploits the laborer is a claim I address in The Left, because I've heard the argument repeated most often by leftists. With that out of the way, enjoy.
That's basically the basics.
Resources are not infinitely abundant. For certain resources, one man's use will detract from the availability of that use for others. Economic systems propose different solutions to managing this scarcity. Action is purposeful behavior, opposed to reflex, instinct, and other non-purposeful behavior. To humans, man acts. Man has ends or goals and employs scarce means to reach those ends or goals. This is a bit technical, but due to the reflective rather than the physical nature of action, we can't conceive of a world of humans that do not act, much less falsify the axiom altogether. Basically, humans use things that are scarce to satisfy their goals. The things that they use may not achieve those goals, but man thought that they would have. So man chooses means based on speculation that those means will satisfy their ends. Man does not err purposefully, but man can err. In addition to action, human reason can't conceive of an existence or of action that doesn't take place through time. Time exists. Man isn't immortal, so the time man has to act is scarce. Since man can't do multiple things at once, I'm talking literally, man has to choose between ends to satisfy. Man will always attempt to satisfy the end ranked most highly to him. Since all action must take place in time, production necessarily involves a period of production. This period describes the length of time that the production of that good takes. Since man's time is scarce, man prefers the period of production of any end to be as short as possible. Since action and time imply choice, man must rank ends from most desirable to least. Man will employ scarce means, which means use things, to meet his most valued end. When that end is satisfied, man will move on to his next most valued end. Ends are not able to be quantified, they are only able to be compared. For example, say you have this value scale. You prefer playing Five Nights at Freddy's 4 over playing Five Nights at Freddy's 3, so you'll choose to play Five Nights at Freddy's 4. You wouldn't say you are 6.5 times happier playing Five Nights at Freddy's 4 than you would have been playing Five Nights at Freddy's 3, but you might say you are better off or worse off playing Five Nights at Freddy's 4 than you would have been if you had chosen to play Five Nights at Freddy's 3. Through attempting to satisfy your ends, you're attempting to move from your current state of affairs to a more desirable state of affairs. Take Logan, for instance. Logan's most valued end is eating a hamburger. So Logan will use the ingredients he has to try to make a hamburger. When he makes and eats the hamburger, he fulfills his desire and is in a preferable state of affairs compared to where he was previously. We call this psychic profit, since Logan's psychic income, which is the psychic benefits he received from satisfying his wants, is larger than the psychic income he would have received from remaining in the state of not eating the hamburger. Say Logan ended up undercooking the hamburger, which caused him to get a stomachache, which was undesirable to him. The psychic income of this state of affairs is now lower than previously, and Logan has experienced a psychic loss. Man is always attempting to make a psychic profit with all action, but he may end up with a psychic loss. Each individual values goods as they are presented by unit, not as entire wholes. When choosing between apples and grapes, for instance, actors don't rid themselves of all grapes to welcome all apples. Instead, the utility of the good lies within a basic unit of that good. The group of homogeneous units of a commodity capable of satisfying the same services to the actor is called a supply. For example, if you have 4 red grapes of the same size and other characteristics, we may say you have a supply of red grapes. The first unit of a supply of goods will always satisfy the most urgent wants that the good is capable of satisfying. For example, say Brian has this value scale. Brian really likes Count Chocula. When he receives 1 box of Count Chocula, this box satisfies his most highly valued end. The next box satisfies the next highest, and so on. Therefore, Brian's first box of Count Chocula has a higher utility and value than the second box, which has a higher utility than the third box, and so on. Also, 1 box is worth less to Brian than 2, which is worth less than 3, which is worth less than 4, and so on. This is called the law of diminishing marginal utility. Leisure is a consumer good, existing to be consumed by the actor who partakes in it. Labor and leisure have an inverse relationship, though, as performing labor necessarily limits the opportunity for leisure, and vice versa. So consumers want as much of a good at as low of a price as possible. Producers want to produce as little of a good at as high of a price as possible. As a result, a producer and consumer negotiate until an agreement is found, or no exchange takes place at all. So say you have this group of individuals, all with their own respective value scales. These 6 people have boxes of Boo Berry cereal. These 6 people want Boo Berry cereal. The number below the suppliers is the price that they'd be willing to sell their goods at, while the number above the consumers is the price that they'd be willing to purchase the supplier's goods for. If we plot these points, we get a supply and demand curve. So a group of individuals in a market can be represented with the supply and demand curve. The supply curve is upward sloping as the quantity of goods supplied to a marketplace is greater as the price increases. The demand curve is downward sloping as the quantity of goods demanded in a marketplace is greater as the price decreases. Although it may seem like these lines are infinitely divisible, this is not the case as we saw in the Boo Berry example, for every point on this line is discrete. The lines are simply drawn for convenience. For example, given the market for Boo Berry boxes, someone who believes the lines are continuous could suggest that at a price of $8.50, there will be a supply of 5.5 boxes of Boo Berry. This doesn't make any sense since the basic unit of the good for sale is a box, and isn't divisible without transforming the good and thus cannot be counted in the supply of boxes. Also, there's no way to have something like 2 1/8 of a person demanding some resource. I mean, does the person demand the thing at that price or not? Also, there's no way to have any horizontal stretches on either the supply or demand curves. If a supply curve has a vertical stretch, this means that the quantity of goods supplied does not change from one price to another. This makes sense. If the supply curve, though, were to have a horizontal stretch, this would mean that the quantity supplied changes even if the price doesn't change. Obviously, this doesn't make any sense. If the demand curve has a vertical stretch, this means that the quantity of the good demanded doesn't change from one price to another, which makes sense. If the demand curve has a horizontal stretch, this means that the quantity demanded changes even if the price doesn't change. This also obviously doesn't make any sense. Now we get on to the evenly rotating economy in the real world. So this is going to be the biggest section of this part because it describes what is colloquially known as the long run. The evenly rotating economy is important to look at because it illustrates the tendency of market equilibrium. So what exactly is it? Well, it's a sort of parallel world in which all individual value scales, time preferences, technological ideas, and given resources remain constant. The rates of production of goods remain constant, prices remain constant, the total population remains constant, etc. There are 2 states of affairs in the ERE. The period of transition to an unchanging, evenly rotating economy, and the unchanging, evenly rotating economy itself. This latter stage is the final equilibrium of the market and is the place where the market tends towards. Since time is evenly rotating in this world, there is no uncertainty. So in the ERE, how does production work? Well, first we start with the factors of production, which are the same as they are in the real world. land, labor, and capital, all of which combine to form some consumer good. In order to produce anything, at least two of the factors must be combined. For example, say I want to make some cooked meat. After wrestling a steer for 3 hours, as one does, I proceed to dig into the beast with my bare hands and take out a good chunk of the meat. Then, using my breath like I'm warming up my hands on a cold winter's eve, I cook the meat. This is what the finished product looks like. At this point, the meat is a consumer good. I've combined two factors of production to produce this meat: my labor and natural resources or land. Say instead I want to produce a sandwich, but I'm not good at making bread. As a result, I approach people who are able to produce bread. Using land and labor, they proceed to produce a slice of bread, which I trade with them for a measly 4 berry seeds. Then, I create the meat in the same fashion and finally combine the bread with the meat to make the final consumer good, a sandwich. This is what's known as the structure of production. At the top of the structure is land and labor, the blocks here are capital goods, and the bottom is the final consumer good. In this example, the bread is a capital good, created to aid in the final production but not be consumed in and of itself. The sandwich is the consumer good. This structure can be extended to represent many more stages of production depending on the industry and final goods produced. The stages of production even out to match the value of labor and land that are put into production. Well, so if everything is labor and land, where does the capitalist come in? Well, in the ERE, the capitalist provides the fourth factor of production: time. As mentioned earlier, all production takes place through time. As a result, the producers of some good must forego present consumption to produce some good in the future. Due to time preference, if the total value of consumption foregone is equal to, say, 10 gold ounces, the price of the consumption good produced must be higher than 10 gold ounces, since the future value is always less than the present value of the same good. If the price of the consumer good is only 10 gold ounces, then the laborers and landowners would be being paid less than their worth, which, in the ERE, would indicate that there are too many factors in this field, so they're going to leave the industry, causing prices to rise. So, say the price of the consumer good is 11 ounces. Where does this extra gold ounce come from? Time. This extra piece is interest, and in this scenario, that interest is collected by the factor owners. However, time isn't something all laborers can simply expend with no mind. The capitalist comes in to pay for this factor, using his saved resources to pay the laborers in the present for ownership of their future goods, which he then sells. The profits he makes in the ERE are not profit at all, but the value of the factor he provides: time. Just as a laborer can also be a landowner, a laborer can be a capitalist, or a capitalist can be a landowner, or a capitalist can be a laborer and landowner. Humanity is not divided into these distinct classes. The only reason they're differentiated here is to show how they provide in the structure of production. By changing conditions in the ERE, we can show where the market in the real world tends. Since the conditions of the real world are constantly changing, though, the conditions of the market will always be in disequilibrium and will never reach the point of the ERE. For example, in the real world, time flows linearly. As a result, the future is uncertain. In this world, the capitalist often plays the role of the entrepreneur, paying the factors for present production based on their expected use for consumers sometime in the future. The entrepreneur, which is often the capitalist, is making a prediction, relieving the factors from having to bear the burden of uncertainty. If the entrepreneur's forecasting is correct and people do demand that resource when the time comes, the entrepreneur is rewarded, his reward matching the degree of how helpful he was in allocating those resources. This is called profit. If the entrepreneur was incorrect and he misdirected resources, he was punished, his punishment matching the degree of how harmful he was in misallocating resources. This is called loss. Profits and losses only exist in the world of uncertainty and are zero in the ERE. However, since uncertainty exists in the real world, profits and losses will always exist in the real world. They are a mechanism of reward and punishment for resource allocation paid for by consumers, not some arbitrary amount of payment distributed by some invisible hand. So just to quickly summarize and wrap up everything I've said here, the structure of production that's presented right now is essentially a more complicated version of previous structures of production, but it's fairly easy to understand once you just kind of get to know what the capitalists are on the left. So essentially what's happening here is that 100 gold at the very bottom is just the consumer price. That's the same thing in the other structures that I've shown you already. That's what the consumer is paying. Now above that is the capital good, and then to the right is the land and labor factors and how much income is accruing to them for whatever they're producing. So the marginal value product of the labor would be, say, 15 gold pieces if that's all that section represents. It could be land and labor, but it's got to be at least one of them, if not both. The 80 gold pieces is, like I said earlier, capital. So that income, though, is not accrued to anybody. It's simply pushed into the next stage, where 16 gold are accrued to land and labor factors, again, whatever ratio that's divided in, and the 60 gold that was originally part of that 80 gold is accrued to capital, which is then pushed up and pushed up and pushed up until finally you get to a point where all there is to accrue income to land and labor factors. So with this structure, that 100 gold pieces is being divided into the hands of land and labor owners no matter what. However, this is where the capitalist comes in. Since all production takes place in time, the capitalist gives money to the land or labor owner in return for ownership of their capital, which they then use to sell the final good. And what income is accrued to them is the interest rate. Because as we talked about earlier, time preference dictates that, the universal fact of time preference dictates that people value present goods more than the same future good. So essentially, if the workers start a thing of production and say it costs 100 gold to do, and then they sell it for 105 gold, because those two things were equal to them. The value of that 105 gold was worth only 100 at the time they started production. So what the capitalist does is he buys all that capital for, say, 100 gold, and then proceeds to sell it for 105 gold. So what he gets is not an entrepreneurial profit, but the interest rate, that cost of time, that 5 gold pieces, and then the 100 gold is returned back to the factor owners, and it's pushed up and up and up. Now there is a capital owner for each section as well. Now they're all the same interest rate, because if they were not, capital owners would switch around and essentially it would become equalized just like land and labor factors would.
Communist infiltration, communist indoctrination, communist subversion, and the international communist conspiracy to sap and impurify all of our precious bodily fluids.
The poor will starve.
Look, the bottom line for the operators of companies is profit. As a result, the people within the company, they're not going to have any want or need to improve the conditions of the poor, because improving those conditions would detract from their own resources, which would decrease their profits and negatively affect their bottom line.
First of all, charity exists, and by the vast number of people who are afraid of this outcome, we can be pretty confident there will be more than enough charity to go around to the unfortunate. Secondly, a market economy improves the lives of everyone, even those who don't participate in direct exchange. Capitalism causes people to find more efficient ways to produce products by producing more with less. People who find ways to use up less scarce resources yet meet more of people's wants are rewarded for doing so. As more and more needs of people are met, others who didn't partake in that production or exchange have access to alternatives that are of lower quality and cheaper, but alternatives they wouldn't have had access to nonetheless. For example, say you invent the car. Due to its extreme scarcity, you will only sell to those who can afford to pay for that car. However, due to its usefulness, your invention will drive others into creating more cars, driving down your prices and improving the quality of their own cars, causing your previous customers to buy their cars. Also, someone finds a way to mass-produce cheap cars and can sell to a huge market of people who wouldn't otherwise be able to afford luxury cars. Now, because of your invention driven by meeting people's needs or just profit, everyone else's state of affairs have drastically increased. Also, why should someone be enslaved to someone else? Are we going to argue that someone's body belongs to someone else based on some arbitrary condition of poverty? How poor does someone have to be owed someone else's production? Further, doesn't the supporter of this view recognize the effects of punishing production and rewarding non-production, maybe, I don't know, there will be less production and less resources for people to use?
Today I think I will explain why instating any minimum wage is harmful. As with any other price floor, large surpluses will develop in the industry. Employers who would have otherwise hired people for a low wage now will not hire anyone at all, either cutting the position entirely or requiring another employee, or themselves, to take up the missing work. Therefore, the general standard of living will decrease.
Yeah, but this study shows...
Empiricism.
So, this group of data illustrates that your claims aren't true, or at least need to be modified.
This is one of two fallacies I hate dealing with. This one's called post hoc ergo propter hoc. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but essentially, someone commits this fallacy when they observe some effect and some other characteristic of the event and claim that the effect was caused by that characteristic. For example, if I were to say, that guy was drinking water when he suddenly had a heart attack, therefore drinking water causes heart attacks. This would be a fallacy. Although this argument isn't exactly strictly related to the left, I often hear it used by leftists. For example, when trying to prove the goodness of the minimum wage, some leftist might say something like, this study shows that after the minimum wage was raised $2, the number of minimum wage jobs remained at about the same level after 5 years. Therefore, raising the minimum wage to a certain level does not cause unemployment. This claim doesn't actually show anything because it's impossible to control for every possible cause for any given test. For example, it could be that the rise in minimum wage decreased profits for the business owners in that area, but they didn't care because they liked their employees. It could be that analyzing the area for only 5 years was insufficient, as the grand majority of businesses had enough capital reserves to leave them running before needing to fire workers. It could be that the demand for money dropped as the minimum wage rose, so the real wages of the workers didn't actually change. The real prices of the goods around them may have. Time preferences may have shifted, the period of production may have changed, and on go the potential causes. However, we do know that humans act, and we know the principles that follow from this foundation. Although we haven't gotten to this claim yet, price floors cause surpluses, which can be derived from the fundamental truths we set up earlier. So no matter what effect is perceived to happen in the empirical world, we know with absolute certainty that violent intervention in voluntary exchange causes the misallocation of resources in some fashion, and thus decreases the state of affairs of the productive.
Capitalism causes war or imperialism.
Well, since the tendency of the rate of the profit to fall is true, companies need to expand their consumer base to untouched areas by conquering areas around the globe through violence, allowing them to postpone the inevitable destruction of capitalism.
Frederick Bastiat once said, "When goods do not cross borders, soldiers will." People who trade with others have a vested interest in ensuring that those trade partners aren't harmed as they directly benefit from their productivity. This is the consequence of people's diversity of skills and the diversity of resources available in different areas, and thus of the division of labor. This issue seems to come from leftist presumption that slavery is an efficient and productive system, which would make their position of state-enforced slavery make more sense. However, as this video sets out to support, the voluntary interaction of individuals is far more beneficial to both participants in the long run than a hegemonic relationship where one party dominates the other. Further, there's the concept of comparative advantage, which I'll talk about later, but essentially it boils down to this. Even when one person in exchange has absolute advantage over another, they still have incentive to trade because the little guy will have comparative advantage in some good. When goods are not being traded, neither party has any care whether the other is killed or otherwise harmed because they themselves aren't hurt by that move. Their source of wealth lies within their own arbitrarily defined borders instead of effectively utilizing those who are better at the task in a different area. Protectionism can cause war. That is not capitalism. Companies don't want to nuke their own customers, and customers don't want to nuke their producers. Further, this Leninist talking point comes from the theory of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, which I'll be talking about later in this portion.
While capitalism unfairly distributes wealth.
Under a system of capitalism, a small percentage of people have the ability to control a large percentage of the wealth in society, while the masses get little to nothing in proportion.
So, this claim can be said in two different ways. It's one thing to claim, although capitalism makes some people better off, the well-being of the masses are decreased at the wealthy's expense. It's another to claim, capitalism is wrong because few people have a lot more money than the majority. As a result, I'll address both separately, starting with the latter. So this whole claim assumes equality is a virtue. That is the entire point behind this claim. That's all of its justification. The proponent of this view would have you believe that people are better off if everyone is equally destitute than if only some were destitute. The proponents of this view are monsters and enemies of the human race. This sort of egalitarianism is nothing but evil wrapped in the attractiveness of fairness. Now, this claim is a little more honorable, but it's still wrong. It just views capitalism as a zero-sum game, but as we've talked about earlier, this is not the case. In fact, people are rewarded for finding ways to make as many uses out of scarce resources as possible, and to thus extend the lives of those resources, themselves, and others. Capitalism benefits all, even those who don't participate in exchange, through providing an abundance of resources as mentioned earlier. People with this view tend to view time as an agent that automatically progresses technology regardless of the system. This isn't true, as all action through time is motivated behavior, and if given separate motivations at any point, they would have done something else. Those that inherit all of their wealth or are lucky don't actually earn anything.
Complete free market capitalism may be based on merit to some degree, but it doesn't account for those who receive their money through inheritance, which they didn't earn, or luck, which they also didn't earn.
Who determines what someone earns and doesn't earn? You? Me? A vote? Say Brian sweeps floors and stocks shelves at a local store. Using the market price as a reference, say he should be being paid $7 an hour. However, his boss likes paying his workers a little more than the market rate, cutting into his own monetary profits but increasing his psychic income, so he pays Brian $7.75 an hour. Does the supporter of this view advocate for forcefully confiscating Brian's extra 75 cents an hour because he didn't earn it? Or is this situation somehow different because Brian isn't the owner's son? If this is the case, what makes familial ties the disqualifying characteristic of charity? Does the supporter of this view advocate for abolishing charity? After all, they didn't earn it. There's also the arbitrary nature of luck, wealth, abolishment. I mean, how can you determine who is lucky and unlucky? Someone in poverty may be earning more than they should be because of luck, while someone who is very wealthy may be earning less than they should be because they're unlucky. This luck principle is just the distribution of wealth repackaged into a form that seems nice and fair. Not to mention there's the devastating effects of confiscating inheritance, like incentivizing people not to care for their children, or not have children at all, and to consume all of one's assets immediately, making what could have been a future with tons of reserve capital and wealth into one of horrible poverty. Out of any tax you can implement, an inheritance tax would have one of the worst effects on humanity.
There is a tendency for the rate of profit to fall.
Well, due to competition within capitalism in the long run, companies will reach a point in which they make zero profits, like all the economists admit. At this point, those capitalists will have to stop operating their companies because they aren't affordable. Here, capitalism's going to collapse.
So, this issue comes from the use of the ERE as the long run in real life, since in the ERE, profits do fall to zero. However, reality, as we addressed, is constantly changing, which is why forecasters exist. A world in which all profits fall to zero is a world where all resources are allocated to their most efficient uses permanently, and capitalists will still have a function because of time preference. So, as long as there is scarcity, resource allocation will need to occur. So long as there is uncertainty, profits and losses will exist. Eliminating uncertainty will just move the world into the ERE, and capitalists will be paid the interest rate, and eliminating scarcity would lead to utopia. Neither of these outcomes lead to the collapse of capitalism in any negative sense, like the Marxists like to imply.
Can I ask what this is about? Yes, I want to hear your opinions about where value comes from.
Well, sure. I think value is determined by labor. I'm gonna need you to step out of the car, sir. Okay, so as I was saying, Value is determined by labor, and the capitalist exploits the laborer since he gets the... Capitalism exploits the laborer.
Well, labor is required to create a product, so the product's value is necessarily valued because of the laborer's involvement in its production. If capitalism was not exploitative, the prices of goods would be equivalent to their cost in terms of labor. Today, the capitalist makes a profit. This is how he stays in business. But since this is the case, the capitalist must be siphoning a cut of the money off of a finished product that the laborers should rightfully be receiving.
So here's the big leftist argument, the labor theory of value. Well, first there's the mud pie argument that the communists hate, but still hasn't been refuted sufficiently. Essentially, since the Marxist believes value comes from labor, if someone spends 6 hours piling up mud, they should earn 6 hours worth of pay. The Marxist says,
No, the labor has to be socially necessary. This is Marxism 101.
Okay, Marxist, so you admit that people value different goods and services differently? If that's the case, don't people value things based on their subjective wants? In other words, isn't value subjective to the consumer? That aside, the Marxists aren't wrong that labor is one of the factors of production that are, at least initially, required to make some product. All production can be traced back to land and labor. But the Marxist doesn't say, the landowner is exploited by capitalists. Why not? Because the Marxist doesn't believe people can own land so long as that land is being used to produce some good. This is because the Marxist differentiates between personal and private property. So for this, Benjamin Tucker, an individualist anarchist, writes, Marx, as we have seen, solved it by declaring capital to be of a different thing from product and maintaining that it belonged to society and should be seized by society and employed for the benefit of all alike. Proudhon scoffed at this distinction between capital and product. He maintained that capital and product are not different kinds of wealth, but simply alternate conditions or functions of the same wealth, that all wealth undergoes an incessant transformation from capital into product and from product back into capital, the process repeating itself interminably, that capital and product are purely social terms, that what is product to one man immediately becomes capital to another, and vice versa, that if there were but one person in the world, all wealth would be to him at once capital and product, that the fruit of A's toil is his product, which, when sold to B, becomes B's capital, that a steam engine is just as much product as coat, and that a coat is just as much capital as a steam engine, and that the same laws of equity govern the possession of the one that govern the possession of the other. Proudhon, Warren, and Tucker are not capitalists, yet they recognize the poor nature of the distinction Marx attempts to make. Peter Kropotkin, pretty much the founder of anarcho-communism, also denounces this difference, although he does advocate for complete takeover of private property and the conquest of bread. He says, nevertheless, some socialists still seek to establish a distinction. Of course, they say, the soil, the mines, the mills, and manufacturers must be expropriated. These are the instruments of production, and it is right we should consider them public property. But articles of consumption, food, clothes, and dwellings should remain private property. Popular common sense has got the better of this subtle distinction. We are not savages who can live in the woods without other shelter than the branches. The civilized man needs a roof, a room, a hearth, and a bed. It is true that the bed, the room, and the house is a home of idleness for the non-producer. But for the worker, a room, properly heated and lighted, is as much an instrument of production as the tool or the machine. It is the place where the nerves and sinews gather strength for the work of the morrow. The rest of the workman is the daily repairing of the machine. And that comes from the conquest of bread. So it's a weak excuse to tell people,
oh, we don't believe in confiscating all of your things, only the evil capitalists.
Using this completely arbitrary distinction, the Marxist claims he isn't here to hurt you, the laborer, just the people richer than you, while claiming that he's principled. He's not. He is here to take whatever he wants, personal or private aside. It's pure deceit. The real anarchists, with some principles, and who are honest, do recognize that they'll be taking all property, that there is no distinction. Marx and the Marxists, the deceitful liars, are going to tell you the opposite, and then they're going to take it all anyway. Alright, back to the original point. Well, there's more to production than labor. Since all production takes place in time, there comes a need for those with capital to fund the current production of resources in return for the ownership of the future product. Even when landowners and laborers are absolutely certain of their future via the ERE, the capitalist is still needed in society. The capitalist provides his own saved capital resources so that laborers don't have to have the burden of time while working on some product, and the capitalist is paid via the interest rate. This is due to the universal fact of time and time preference. As a result, the value of a good is imbued with more than just labor. It is also necessarily imbued with time, and the capitalist provides the worth of that time to the laborer. If the Marxist still doesn't find this argument satisfying since labor was required in production, the Marxist must be unsatisfied with the voluntary trade itself. If this is the case, the Marxist has to assert that the laborer has no right to trade the product of his labor, and if that's the case, the laborer must not truly own the product at all. So, Marxist, who owns the product of one's own labor, if not oneself? At least, who is able to decide whether the product of your labor can be traded or not, if not you? If the answer is anything but,
You're right, I have the right to decide whether I want to trade the product of my labor or not.
go watch my last video on argumentation ethics. Capitalism exploits the consumer.
Capitalism tends towards costs and revenue being equivalent, so when a company receives revenue above the cost of their inputs, they must be receiving some extra money from consumers that they should not be charging.
So this is the Keynesian version of the Marxist exploitation theory. This mostly comes from the inability to differentiate the ERE from the real world, just like the Marxists. The market tends towards revenue meeting costs, but will always be in disequilibrium due to the ever-changing and uncertain nature of the real world. Prices actually determine costs, not the other way around. This misconception comes from the linear flow of time, where it seems that costs determine prices. However, producers bid up the price of input costs of industries they enter, while bidding down the cost of the consumer or capital goods they go to sell. There must be a winner and loser to every interaction.
In capitalism, companies that attempt to compete in the marketplace will either win and stay in business or lose and have to shut down.
When referring to competition and the failing of inefficient businesses, so what? Would the supporter of this view be suggesting that businesses which are using more resources than they should be to produce a product not enough people want, at too low or high of a price, be artificially propped up by sending police to citizens' doors and collecting money from them at gunpoint to be used to fund this horribly inefficient company? How is this at all logical, or even considered to be moral on any level? Second of all, no, there's not a winner and loser in every interaction. Every interaction involves two winners. In a trade, both actors want to improve their current positions by meeting some end. This is established through synthetic a priori truths. If they end up trading, both actors have employed the means they believe will best meet their ends. After the trade has taken place, one party may realize he greatly benefited while the other realizes he only slightly benefited. One may realize his position has greatly worsened while the other has only worsened slightly. One may have slightly benefited while the other slightly worsened, etc. Either way, the trade is seen as mutually beneficial for both parties the moment the trade takes place. The Marxists like to say,
Yes, both parties view their well-being as increasing before and during the interaction. However, this isn't freedom because one of the parties has to choose between death and doing whatever labor the other party wants. So technically, sure, the position of both parties is improving, but this isn't really an agreement free from coercion. Yes, under capitalism, you are free not to work for X company, but the consequence of not working for X company is the inability to pay for food. Under capitalism, you are free. Free to starve.
First of all, to counteract a bumper sticker phrase with a bumper sticker phrase, you could say, sure, people are free to starve under capitalism. Under socialism, you're forced to starve. They purposefully mesh the concepts of an abundance of exchangeable goods with freedom to try to appeal to people who like freedom and liberty. It's a deceitful tactic. That's all Marxists are at the end of the day. You can theoretically be a slave that lives in comfort and be a free man that exists in a state of destitution, say on a deserted island. The Marxists are literally saying the Orwellian phrase, freedom is slavery, by attempting to change the colloquial definition of freedom to one that suits their agenda. The nature of man is to be in this state of destitution and poverty. If a man is on a deserted island, is he forced to gather coconuts? If so, by what? The trees? The coconuts? The land itself? Nature? They might say, yes, nature coerces man into eating to live. Well, if this is the case, the definition of coercion is one that literally always exists at all times, no matter the system enacted. The Marxist socialist dream would be coercive, because it forces some people to produce food for the sake of others. This definition is of no use to anyone, as humans can clearly distinguish between acts of murder, theft, and rape compared to the natural results of mankind's relationship with nature. This argument is just another deceitful tactic employed by Marxists, similar to the meshing of concepts of freedom and their distinguishing between private and personal property. So, let's say they don't say that, and they say,
No, nature doesn't coerce man into eating to live. Man does when he gains some sort of property. Someone's appropriation of resources that would have been previously available for the victim's use is no longer available because the property owner took it all.
This is the infamous coconut argument. It goes like this. There are two people who crash land on a deserted island. One person, let's call him Logan, wakes up first. Logan gathers all the coconuts on the island and puts them in a heap. Brian wakes up shortly afterwards, hungry. Logan tells Brian that he can have a coconut if Brian cuts his own arm off. In this scenario, Brian has the choice to cut his arm off or die. Therefore, Brian should have the right to whatever coconuts he needs to live without having to make this terrible choice. First of all, this argument clearly doesn't carry over to a larger group. For instance, say 2,000 people land on the island. Each of them will claim what they can and partake in the division of labor, given that a state is informed. This argument isn't so much an attack on the division of labor, though, or capitalism as it functions, but rather an attack on private property and ownership which undergirds capitalism. For a more complete refutation on this point, watch my video on argumentation ethics. So what does this argument really mean? Either Brian has the right to tell Logan what to do so long as he is in a life-threatening situation, or Brian has the right over Logan's accumulated work. If the first is the case, Logan is enslaved to Brian. For example, if Logan and Brian are of the same blood type, and Brian is bleeding out, the Marxists would have to suggest that Logan be required to siphon blood out of himself and into Brian, despite his control over his own blood. If Brian needed an organ transplant, the Marxists would necessarily have to suggest that Logan give up his own organs, potentially damaging his life permanently, but not killing him, for the sake of someone else regardless of his own wants. He does not control his own body, his organs, his blood, according to the Marxist. The Marxist does. Hell, theoretically, the Marxist justifies rape so long as the rapist needs to rape in order to live. After all, the victim's body isn't really theirs. If it's the second option, where Brian has the right over Logan's accumulated work, why would Logan do any work at all if not for immediate consumption, knowing that his extra efforts will be of no use to him in the future? On a deserted island, sure, both participants may be incentivized to work together regardless. But given this scenario where the evil Logan gathers too many coconuts, should we not assume Logan is entirely motivated by self-interest, and thus will not cooperate with Brian if he is not incentivized to? This seems to be the basic assumption the Marxist makes when posing this question. So if we bring this argument back to personal versus private property, what if Logan claimed that all the coconuts he gathered were his own personal property? That instead of offering Brian any for any price, they were all his? Would the Marxists dare break their principles and suggest Brian not only has a right over Logan's capital or private property, but that Brian has a right over Logan's personal property as well?
Logical, unemotional, completely pragmatic.
One firm will take over. Well, without the government to break big businesses apart, the businesses are going to just form oligopolies and then eventually just a single monopoly. And at this point, they're just going to stop businesses from competing against them, and they'll just raise prices and lower production, and everybody will be worse off.
First of all, there are multiple definitions of monopoly. So we have to narrow this down in order to truly address this argument. The first one is, monopoly exists when a firm has control over its price. I mean, this is ridiculous. Everyone has control over the price of their goods. Consumers choose whether they're going to pay for it. In economics courses, there's a distinction made between price makers and price takers. The difference isn't really a difference at all, as firms of both types want to produce at their profit maximizing point and have as much control over their prices as other firms. This issue really comes from the myth of perfect competition versus monopolistic competition.
Your concern is not to help the people.
So the supporters of this view conclude that a company that produces a product can create an infinite supply, and so long as they leave the good at a specific price, they can sell their entire supply. They claim demand is perfectly elastic under these conditions. The biggest issue with this is it conflates calculus with economics. There exist, as we established earlier, only discrete steps on a demand curve. There are no infinitely small steps as there would be in calculus, and hence no derivatives to take at all. The drawing of the line is purely to simplify, not to draw conclusions from. So say there exists some water bottling company producing in a market with other water bottling companies. The firm's demand curve looks like this. The perfect competition fans would have you believe that a firm that produces 70 million water bottles will sell at the same price as if they produced 3 water bottles. If this firm were to set the price of each of their water bottles at $2.49 instead of $2.50, are we to believe that all demand would disappear and nobody would buy a single bottle? Further, if the demand curve is perfectly elastic, this would imply that all firms in a market could radically increase their supply, yet no price changes would occur. This is a completely absurd theory and should be completely discarded. Further, if the claim is going to be, yeah, perfect competition isn't realistic, but it's still an ideal, this isn't an ideal at all. If companies were able to produce millions of a product and sell at the same price, there will be a massive misallocation of factors. On a quick side note, the hyper-focus on the theory of the firm in neoclassical economics has produced a huge amount of misleading information. A huge part of neoclassical economics has been about analyzing cost curves, as if cost curves are some given. As we have seen before, unlike what it might seem like to the passive observer, in the ERE, costs are determined by price, which is determined by consumer demand, not the other way around. In the immediate run, when it is time to sell a product, all costs are treated as sunk costs. So when attempting to adequately produce factors, businesses have to speculate as to how much demand there will exist at some future date. When that future date is reached, the business treats all costs as sunk and attempts to maximize revenue. The massive error that the neoclassical theory of the firm makes is its ignorance of time. Marginal revenue and marginal cost are not being collected and paid out simultaneously. Profits instead are based on uncertainty, not marginal cost. The assumption that a firm will produce where its marginal revenue equals its marginal cost is thus a faulty one. So, this sets up a world of monopolistic competition at all times. If it is conceded that all industries are monopolies over their own product, this theory of monopoly is useless because there's no way to draw any difference between them. At what point does a firm's demand curve become too inelastic to start interfering?
And I'll say again, no, it's been often said.
Another definition is the following. Monopoly is a grant of special privilege by the state, reserving a certain area of production to one particular individual or group. This is the useful definition of monopoly. However, anti-capitalists don't use this definition, so we'll just move on to the final one. The last definition, and the one that we are going to extensively cover, is a firm that has achieved monopoly price.
Your concern is just to bring discomfort, my friend, and your policy is just a little red.
So, as you can see, here's a diagram of a firm's supply and demand. The demand is elastic, and the firm produces an amount of goods equal to S. At the moment, the firm is producing at the so-called competitive price. Change the market a bit, and the demand curve begins to become more inelastic. Now, the firm shifts its supply to S prime, restricting production and raising prices. The firm has achieved the dreaded monopoly price. First of all, cutting production leads to a subsequent freeing up of factors to be used somewhere else. However, we know wants aren't left unfilled if there are means available to achieve those wants. If every business was a monopoly and had these so-called monopoly prices, where do all the unused factors go? Some say that monopolies, as opposed to firms in competitive markets, make a permanent monopoly profit. To investigate this claim, let's go into the ERE. Say this firm that makes NFTs is a monopoly and is thus earning permanent monopoly profits. Let's say the revenue this firm brings in for one NFT is equal to 0.085 Ethereum. Since uncertainty doesn't exist in the ERE, as specified by the permanent qualifier, the 0.085 Ethereum must be distributed throughout the structure in some manner. The owners of capital accrue nothing but interest, so the monopoly gains are actually returned to the laborers and landowners. More importantly, the entire concept of monopoly price is illusory. There's no way to differentiate between the competitive price and the monopoly price. Say Nate's hamburger stand has some supply of hamburgers, call it S. There exists some demand for Nate's hamburgers, call this curve D. Is this the competitive or monopoly price? There's no way of knowing. Say that Nate decides that he'll make more money if he cuts production and raises prices, resulting in a movement like this. Has he achieved a monopoly price now? How do you or anyone else know if he moved from an inefficient price below the competitive price to the competitive price? Why is it assumed that Nate is now acting as a monopoly? Are we to penalize all businesses that restrict production in any way? Someone might say, no, a firm is acting monopolistically if it sets a price above marginal cost. This is a similar issue brought up earlier. The tendency for price to meet cost is equal to zero in the ERE, not the real world. This is a tendency, not a precondition of the market. Companies will hurt people not involved in exchange if it helps them.
Yes, companies do not want to hurt their consumers, else they risk losing their business. However, both companies and their consumers don't care about the effects their dealings may have on unrelated third parties. Therefore, companies need to be regulated insofar as they have some negative effect on a third, unconsenting party.
This is another huge claim. There's two options here. The first is the negative externality is aggression, which is actively and physically affecting an unconsenting party, or the negative externality is unpleasant for a third party but not aggressive. So to address the first one, given that the victim can prove the aggressor physically harmed them non-consensually, the aggressor owes the victim restitution and is liable for retributive punishment. To demonstrate this, say there is a company and there's a neighborhood somewhat nearby. And the company installs a pipe to go right by the neighborhood, and the company starts manufacturing goods. Now, the product of that good isn't harmful in and of itself, but the byproduct of its production pumps poisonous fluorine gas into the pipe, which all goes immediately into the neighborhood and kills a bunch of people. That's aggression. So yes, this can also apply to pollution. But here's a quick aside on environmentalism. If someone owns a lake, say, and they proceed to throw plastic into this lake and it kills all the fish, I don't care, and neither you nor I have a right over that person or property. The environmentalists who advocate for reducing fossil fuel consumption or reducing consumption of rare resources are advocating for the destitution, if not extinction, of the human race. All resources are scarce to some degree. What resources are we allowed to use, and which ones must be saved for the future, dear environmentalists? Also, what right do the future generations have over us, and why don't the generations after them have the right over them? This is condemning humanity to a fate of suffering, poverty, and death. Anyone who would demolish the homes of people, or even murder vast amounts of them, to save one of 200 species of mosquito is an enemy of the human race and a proponent of the mosquitoes.
Communism, I can see it in the things you do.
That aside, we move on to the second negative externality. So, building a pink house when you really don't like pink could be seen as a negative externality. This is of no concern to anyone. To say otherwise would mean that anyone's complaint about anything would have to be adhered to, and thus that people don't own their own bodies and have no ability to consent without the permission of somebody else. Say Nate and Logan are talking on a sidewalk. Brian, who is across the street and outside of the conversation, claims that Nate and Logan are being annoying and thus harming him. He calls the police, who sees Logan and Nate, and force them to hand monetary damages over to Brian. If this situation isn't clearly and obviously wrong to you, watch my video on the libertarian ethic to show why this position is indefensible.
People that are very good at producing things have no need to trade with people who are not as good at producing things.
Large communities or companies which are better than small communities or companies at their own game will refuse to trade with those smaller communities or companies.
So to counter this point, we turn to a classical economist, David Ricardo. Ricardo developed an economic theory known as comparative advantage, which describes how two groups who produce the same goods may interact. So to demonstrate how this works, take two companies in two different locations, Bryan Company and Logan Corporation. Both produce dumbbells and fidget spinners. On the x-axis is the quantity of dumbbells, while the y-axis is the quantity of fidget spinners. Since resources are scarce, factors cannot be allocated to both such that a maximum number of dumbbells and fidget spinners are being produced. Assume that Logan can either produce 90 fidget spinners or 20 dumbbells, while Brian can produce 10 fidget spinners or 7 dumbbells. The points, which are discrete, on this line describe the amount of goods that can be produced if some amount of factors are allocated towards dumbbells and some are allocated toward fidget spinners. At first glance, it might seem like there's no reason why Logan would want to trade with Brian, considering he can produce more than Brian in both regards. However, Logan would still benefit from trading with Brian. To make this clear, let's put this in a table. If we do some simple math, we find that for each fidget spinner Logan produces, he will lose the opportunity to make 0.22 dumbbells. For each fidget spinner Brian produces, he will lose the opportunity to make 0.7 dumbbells. Since Brian loses more dumbbells per fidget spinner than Logan, Brian will produce dumbbells and Logan will produce fidget spinners. So in order to benefit from the trade, Logan wants more than 2/9 of a dumbbell per fidget spinner he gives Brian. Brian wants more than 10/7 of a fidget spinner per dumbbell he gives Logan. If the parties decide to trade their resources at 3 dumbbells per 1 fidget spinner, both parties benefit. Now, Logan's opportunity cost for dumbbells falls, while Brian's opportunity cost for fidget spinners falls. Despite Logan being better than Brian at all production then, they still managed to come to a mutually beneficial agreement.
Without a minimum wage, companies won't pay their workers enough to live.
Well, since companies are motivated by profit, they wish to maximize their revenue while minimizing their costs. To do this, they'll just pay their workers very, very little, and they'll just drop their costs of production.
So in this, I'm going to address a little bit about the effects of the minimum wage. So first of all, companies compete in the labor market in the same way they compete in the consumer goods market, driving wages as close as possible to the DMVP, which is the discounted marginal value product of the factors. So to explain what that is, essentially, it's the value that the labor produces. In the ERE, the laborer's income is equal to their marginal value product. The discounted part, or the D in DMVP, comes from time preference and having the capitalist receive a certain amount of that income in the form of the interest rate, as discussed earlier. Some people have worries about monopsony, but the theory is invalid for the same reasons the market can't be ruled by one big cartel, which will be addressed later. Oligopsony is invalid because there is no infinitely elastic supply curve that could ever exist in the real world, just as there's no infinitely elastic demand curve that could ever exist in the real world. This is another mistake of treating models inappropriately. Another issue that arises with minimum wage focuses on people's political want for a living wage. Sometimes the proponents of the minimum wage will agree that a minimum wage causes job loss. They might say something like,
People can't survive off of $5 an hour, so even if the minimum wage cuts some people's jobs, ultimately that cut doesn't really make a tangible difference to them. Just as someone who makes $5 an hour can't live off of that salary, someone who makes no money can't live off of that salary. However, more people will be given higher salaries than will be unemployed if the minimum wage is raised. So, the minimum wage is still more beneficial than leaving the free market alone.
Further, some people try to make the argument that when more people are getting paid, they're putting more back into the economy, which, stimulates spending and all of that sort. This technically is true, but it doesn't benefit anybody. What it's doing is taking resources that would have been allocated somewhere else and shifting them towards the people who are forcefully rewarded with money they shouldn't have had in the first place. This isn't helping anybody. Well, let's return to the ERE and the structure of production. Here, laborers are paid their DMVPs, and thus earn an income based on the worth of their labor to other people. Remember, this system makes it so resources are properly allocated to where they belong. Say a capitalist sells a group of final consumers' goods making about $100 an hour. The laborer who sweeps the floors is paid $4 during this period of an hour. Since this is in the ERE, there are no profits. The capitalist is paid in interest, and the rest of the money is paid out in income to the respective factor owners. What does this mean of the floor sweeper? Well, the sweeper is being paid his DMVP, or the value he provides to the consumer. Since this is the ERE, if he was paid less than his DMVP, he would leave this industry and work where he is needed more. If he was paid more, others would flood this stage until the wage was dropped to his DMVP. Therefore, the only time the wage rate of a laborer would be below his DMVP is in the real world, where everything is uncertain. However, we know the market of the real world is always tending toward equilibrium, and is thus always tending toward paying the DMVP to the factor owners. So, let's introduce 3 people: Brian, Nate, and Logan. Brian works at Scott Cawthon Games, Nate works at Toby Fox Industries, and Logan works at the Food Lion. Brian stocks shelves, Nate works the cash register, and Logan is an assistant manager. In the ERE, they are paid their DMVPs. Brian is paid $8 an hour, Nate is paid $10 an hour, and Logan is paid $15 an hour. In a given instant in the real world, say, Brian is paid $8 an hour, Nate is paid $8 an hour, and Logan is paid $13 an hour. Given all else constant, as time continues, Brian will continue being paid his worth, Nate will eventually be paid $10 an hour, and Logan will be paid $15 an hour. What happens if the local government decides that $8 an hour isn't enough to live off of, and institutes a minimum wage of $10? Well, Brian's wage will go up to 10, Nate's wage will go up to 10, and Logan's wage will remain at 13. As time moves on, eventually Scott Cawthon Games will have to fire Brian, which is sad but true, as they make a loss since they are forced to pay more than Brian's worth. Nate will continue to work at $10 an hour. Logan will eventually make $15 an hour. This might seem like all the minimum wage did, at least for Nate, was properly dictate Nate's wage based on what he should have been receiving. This is clearly deceiving, though, for multiple reasons. For one, although Brian's services are demanded by consumers, the government has arbitrarily stopped Brian from being able to provide that desired service. Secondly, the assumption that all else remains constant is an unfounded one, since desires, time preferences, the rate of production of goods, and more absolutely do not remain constant in the real world. Since this is the case, no matter where the minimum wage is set, in time, society will be damaged more than benefited.
People will hoard their wealth.
Spending is necessary to increase production, as spending increases the revenue of companies and thus stimulates that company's production. If the people who hold a vast amount of wealth refuse to spend their money, production is going to stall and society will come to a standstill.
So the economist of this view might say,
while the hoarder who refuses to spend his money decreases the amount of money that would be received by the retailer. In order to avoid losses, the retailer pays less to the manufacturers of the good they're selling. In order for the manufacturers to avoid losses, they lay off some workers. Now, these workers have less money to spend at retailers, starting the cycle over again until humanity is in a state of destitution.
Except this isn't what happens at all. When a firm notices they aren't making profits, they do one of two things. For one, they cut prices. They don't just start cutting production. If this is the case, other firms will do the same, and this is indicative of the purchasing power of everyone's money rising. So the hoarder is actually making your dollar worth more. Or they purchase less from their manufacturers, as was described, or cut costs in some other way. Well, this is indicative of using up too many resources in production. Now those resources are free to be used somewhere else where it's more demanded. The idea that this could cause the destitution of society is due to a misunderstanding of hoarding and dishoarding, which is simply the change of the demand for money. People may hoard money for a variety of reasons, all of which will pay off if they're correct, or won't pay off if they're incorrect. Not to mention the ethical implications of seizing somebody else's money. There's also the arbitrary nature of labeling how much money is too much to be hoarded. The principled Keynesian should confiscate all savings not put into use, which would devastate anyone who may be preparing for a disaster of some sort. I'm not going to go through every Keynesian argument in this, just the ones that got really popular. If there's one for it though, comment, and if there's enough comments, I'll make a video where I address stuff like the consumption function, liquidity preference, etc.
Companies will take advantage of disasters by raising prices on rare goods.
For some scarce goods, companies may charge very high prices. People might need gasoline in the crisis, for example, but gas companies looking to take advantage of the situation may just charge exorbitant prices that nobody could afford, but they still need the gas, so they're going to lower their bank accounts and spend tons and tons of money on gasoline when it should be cheaper.
So this has been going around the news a lot recently, especially with gas prices rising. Like Elizabeth Warren went on Joy Reid's show and talked about how gas prices are rising because of price gouging. High prices indicate the low stock versus the high demand of the given resource. They send signals to all entrepreneurs that gasoline is necessary in the future and that they'll be heavily rewarded if they can find a way to enter the industry and provide for people's needs. That said, if the government decides to control prices and set some price ceiling, people will purchase mass amounts of the good, causing serious shortages in the supposedly necessary good. To get around this, the state claims they will limit purchasing through a ration system. This was the entire point of pricing. All the state did was create a more inefficient version of the pricing system through central planning. First of all, the state's artificial meddling in who can have how many resources is entirely arbitrary and will always have a negative effect on resource allocation. Now, those who gain favor with the state will have access to more resources. Those who bribe state officials to get around the rations will be given more resources. Now, instead of production being rewarded, people are rewarded for their connections with political officials. Instances of bribery will skyrocket, while production will decrease or stall. Capitalism causes automation, and automation can cause people to lose their livelihoods.
Capitalists, interested in profit, will replace their labor force with automatons so long as they are cheaper to purchase and operate, causing laborers to lose their jobs.
So consumers, and thus society at large, should be forced to remain as they are because some people who are worse at the job would lose their jobs? If a machine were to be invented that can complete open heart surgery at a near 100% success rate, would the people of this view be arguing that this machine be destroyed, no matter how many lives it could save? How is this not horribly selfish, and not selfish as in self-interested, selfish as in actively harming others to better oneself? Should we destroy calculators so people can be hired to perform calculations in their head? Should we destroy cars so more people can be hired to carry others in horse and buggy? Should we destroy the wheel so more people can be hired to drag other people around? Obviously, this absolute abolition of technology would effectively destroy humanity, but is this not what the proponent of this view would argue?
Consumers are ignorant. They don't know what's best for them.
Consumers don't have the ability to make rational choices about what goods are better than others. For example, how could someone unfamiliar with cars understand the differences between the manufacturing of Volkswagens versus Toyotas beyond a surface level? How could they choose between those options if they don't even know the difference?
So for all the Democrats, and Democrats with a small d, who ask this question, if people are so ignorant, why can they vote in government elections? I mean, if anything, that would be worse, because at least in the market, it's deciding only their own fate, and maybe their own ignorant fate is going to hurt them. But in government elections, that's directly affecting everybody else. Why would you want so-called ignorant people dictating your life? Secondly, this worry comes from a misunderstanding of capitalism at large, and actually points out a very large problem of socialism. Someone participating in a free capitalist economy doesn't have to understand the intricacies of the products they purchase. Instead, they make a purchase based on what they think is best. If it turns out that they are in a better state of affairs than they were without the thing that they bought, the product is great, and they may purchase it again and recommend others to do the same. Otherwise, they're at a loss and will not purchase it again and recommend others to do the same. Either way, it's them being helped or hurt. Additionally, companies will arise to do this checking for others, and the products that are certified correctly and do the job they are purchased to do will be bought by consumers. Examples of this private certification include kosher companies like KLBD Kosher, OU Kosher, and OK Kosher, and etc. are all companies of this sort that food companies pay to certify their foods so that they appeal to a larger market. A socialist mode of production does require the voters to understand the intricacies of two different otherwise similar products in order to decide where to allocate resources, or understand the depth and differences of knowledge several politicians or central planners may have so that they can be the ones to allocate resources. Since under a state of socialism nobody owns anything, but there only exist caretakers of resources, people aren't able to gauge what is and isn't most efficient, which is where the economic calculation problem comes in. But this video isn't about dismantling socialism, which might be a future video.
Every 77 years, there's a great president. Washington, and then you go 77 years, Lincoln,
really?
77 years.
Yeah.
There's, what's that guy's name?
Theodore Roosevelt?
FDR.
FDR.
And then another 77 years, you got W.
Really?
And then I think we're in historic times.
Mm-hmm.
Protectionism, which can only be enacted by a state, is necessary for both a healthy economy and culture.
Free trade increases the wealth of foreigners that do not put their resources back into the American economy. A nation void of tariffs will inevitably lead to it being surpassed by other nations economically.
Alright, so this is the kind of thing that should cause the Leninists to really worry, because protectionism definitely leads to war and definitely incentivizes it. First of all, unlike plenty of modern economic thought, there would be no separate study of international trade on the free market. It would be exactly the same as the free market domestically. So, to address the argument at hand, the restriction of trade by arbitrary borders would do nothing but harm everyone within that nation, as they'll be able to access what would have been affordable goods that would increase their current state of affairs. Further, people who would have purchased these cheap, widely available goods are now forced to purchase a more expensive version of those goods, or a different good entirely, skewing production in favor of inefficient firms at the expense of efficient ones. This policy rewards companies that would make losses, misallocate scarce resources, and hurt society at large, while punishing companies that would make profits, allocate scarce resources properly, and help society at large. The entire point of protectionism is completely arbitrary and makes no sense when followed logically. The proponent of protectionism might say,
the purchasing of all foreign goods should have a tariff such that their goods are equivalent or higher in price than domestic goods. This will boost domestic industry at the expense of foreign industry.
Okay, but why stop at the United States? If this principle made any sense economically, shouldn't New York close its borders to trade with Montana? Shouldn't counties in Montana close trade with other counties? Shouldn't cities close trade with other cities? Shouldn't households close trade with other households? Obviously, this would drive humanity into utter poverty. The protectionist might answer,
New York and Montana are part of the same country, so no.
well, why does that matter at all? The protectionist might claim that those within the country have a shared national identity. So what? If they value this identity, they wouldn't trade with foreign countries in the first place. If there's something else to national identity, what and why don't people value it? Is it a shared culture? Would then the proponent of this be suggesting that people of one culture can't peacefully trade with those of another culture, even if they're separate? Further, would those of this view be in favor of a forced sort of ethno-state in which anyone not of a specific culture are driven out of arbitrarily defined borders and sent to an area of different arbitrarily defined borders, and then they can't trade with each other? Also, wouldn't they concede that a household on the northern border of Montana may have as much of a shared history and culture as those on the southern border of Alberta? I mean, Montana is certainly closer to Alberta than Montana is to South Carolina. Protectionism is incoherent, and, if adopted logically, would lead to the devastation of civilization, not its promotion.
Hey, Albert, yes, Alan?
You make a decent point, but there's never been an anarchic society in history before.
Historicism.
The wild growth of Standard Oil in American history illustrates that your claims about capitalism being void of monopoly aren't true, or at least need to be modified.
So this line of argument is just like empiricism. It's just historicism. The same fallacy is committed, post hoc ergo propter hoc. I can't stand this fallacy. Plus, appeals to history are of no productive use in argument if both parties aren't historians. If me and you are in an argument about the market for defense and you say something like, the Hudson Bay Company's actions in the 1730s show that companies are incentivized to use violence against peaceful people, and I know nothing about the Hudson Bay Company's actions in the 1730s, what is this supposed to mean to me? What if I were to say something like, yeah, well, back in 1624, the anarchic private property society in northern Umbria in Italy was very peaceful and extremely wealthy? Would this mean anything to you if you didn't know anything about Cospaia? How could this possibly lead to a productive argument? This isn't to say history is useless and can't be used in argument at all, rather that historical claims are not useful in and of themselves in this kind of argument, just as empirical claims are not useful in and of themselves in this kind of argument. History has a ton of use, just like empirics, especially within the entrepreneurial field. Forecasting based on the past is what successful entrepreneurs do. However, historicism and empiricism alike have no place in rational argument on economics.
Capitalism is profit over people. Businesses are constantly trying to minimize costs and maximize revenue, causing their owners to have incentive to practically abuse workers by giving them low wages and forcing them to work in poor conditions and trick consumers into buying their needless products.
This claim really comes down to three different sub-claims: poor work conditions, low wages, and advertising. The first one we already addressed. Employers want to provide better and better work conditions for their laborers to draw them away from other businesses. Low wages is the same thing. Employers want to pay more for their workers to the upper limit of their DMVP to draw them away for other businesses. But what about advertising? The proponents of this claim seem to think that producers are creating wants in their consumers' heads. First of all, how can some people be so fooled into buying some useless product by an advertiser, but the person who makes this claim can so bravely resist the advertisements? And which of people's wants are created and which aren't? Are all of society's wants created by this class of good advertisers? I mean, if this is the case, how are they not convinced of other advertisements? If some wants aren't created, which ones? And if all wants are created, or if I'm to believe that advertisers are putting thoughts into people's heads, why am I to believe that your thoughts aren't those that are being dispensed by advertisers? If some wants aren't created, why would businessmen go through the arduous process of creating and then implementing wants for people? Wouldn't it be much easier to appeal to consumers' current wants? I mean, the proponent of this claim, the kind of people that I usually argue with that would say something like this, insist that hedonism is somehow more profitable than wants that promote savings, but this view is completely ridiculous and just stems from a lack of understanding of profits and losses. Remember, profits and losses are based on entrepreneurial forecasting about consumer demand. So good forecasters are rewarded if they appeal to current consumer demand, and are paid based on how well they allocated those resources. So if savings are demanded and they provide a service that promotes savings, they're going to be paid. To say that companies would rather go through the expensive, risky, and useless advertising process to change people's wants makes no sense at all. Ultimately, I think this view comes from people who are told the status quo is capitalism, then observe the world to be hedonistic, then make the conclusion that capitalism causes hedonism. As a result, they have to find a way to get around the rationale of capitalism, and to do so, they claim advertisers are changing everyone's wants, except theirs, of course, since they can passionately argue against it. With that argument addressed, the proponent of this view may still hold their foundation of capitalism causing hedonism. Capitalism, however, doesn't cause hedonism. The state causes this phenomenon. I'll address this shortly. Capitalism involves a war of all against all.
Capitalism, with its constant competition, causes everyone to be in conflict with one another instead of cooperating with one another.
I think the roots of this argument come from the Hobbesian view of the state of nature. Man is in constant conflict with man and thus needs a sovereign to promote peace between men. To address this Hobbesian lie quickly, say Brian and Logan are two people who own property. Without someone regulating their every action, Brian and Logan are supposedly in constant violent conflict with one another until one eventually reigns supreme. Just as Logan is about to finish Brian off and steal all of his things, Nate steps in and declares himself this sovereign, supposedly stopping Logan and Brian from fighting. However, Nate's a human too, and will exploit Logan and Brian in the same way they were just violently attacking each other. As Nate's safety increases, Logan and Brian's safety decreases. Nate's position as the sovereign hasn't helped at all. In fact, he's made the situation much worse since he is held in higher regard than the peons Logan and Brian. This is the same with regard to the referee some people hold the state to be in the market. Of course, to exist, the state needs a certain amount of production to leech off of, so they allow a small amount of capitalistic behavior to occur, else they kill themselves off, just as a virus can kill a host if it's too deadly. Capitalism is the only system compatible with the peaceful resolution of conflict. Argument. If you want more information as to why that's the case, watch my last video outside of this series on argumentation ethics.
Capitalism promotes selfish materialism, consumerism, and degeneracy.
Capitalism promotes a culture of constantly wanting the next trendy thing, one that constantly consumes what is put in front of them. Companies are incentivized to produce hedonistic people so that their products are constantly being bought, which guarantees them profits with their bottom line.
Consumerism, degeneracy, and selfish materialism are not caused by capitalism. Since people own their own bodies and the things they produce, free market capitalism allows people to trade however they see fit. The division of labor is promoted in society, and as a result, those who have a very high time preference, which means they want more things in the present, will be led towards constant consumption at the expense of savings and future wealth. Those with very low time preference are provided with tools for increasing their wealth and preparing for the future. As established earlier, capitalism provides for the environment for people to meet their ends as best as possible, whether those ends be oriented towards high time preference activities or low time preference activities. Everything else remaining constant, though, the amount of a good that can be produced increases over time. If someone with a low time preference chooses to forego present gratification in the hopes of more future gratification, they will spend a longer production period producing some larger amount of a demanded good. If it turns out that the saver investor's action was correct, which it often is, his time preference rate will be reduced even more, investing in more projects using his accumulated capital. In hunter-gatherer times, say, the high time preference person may spend each day hunting and gathering food to be immediately consumed. The low time preference person may attempt to settle down and spend time planting and cultivating some wild seed they found, eventually to be rewarded with plentiful food. As a result, even the high time preference rate of the other individuals will fall, since the marginal utility of present food has fallen as a result of the saver. Due to free market exchange and ownership, civilization progresses. The state, though, does not produce. It confiscates the production of the low time preference individuals that would be providing for all of society and redistributes it to the high time preference individuals and to the members of the state. Now, people are rewarded for being parasitic state agents and for having a high time preference, while the saver investor, which would have been rewarded for saving and investing, is permanently punished so long as the state exists. This hegemonic relationship between the state and its subjects sets in motion a process of decivilization, ultimately until humanity is reduced to utter destitution. Capitalism sets in motion a process of civilization, tending toward peace and prosperity.
Capitalism treats people as machines, not as human beings. Laborers punch in and punch out on a strict 9-to-5 schedule, unable to participate in all the other things that make them happy.
So again, capitalism leads to technological progress, civilizational progress, and prosperity. Through capitalism, previously extremely rare and inaccessible resources are transformed into common and accessible resources. As time progresses, people are able to afford more leisure and more pleasant and engaging work than what was previously available. For example, there existed a point in time in which every waking moment for the average person was one of uncertainty as to whether they would make it through the day. As time progressed, people became more and more secure in their person and thus able to focus on other fulfilling activities outside of bare subsistence due to the activities of those who invested in long-term activities of large production. As people become wealthier as the result of this production, the marginal utility of their present dollar falls, allowing more of their actions to be safely replaced with leisure or investment in greater opportunities. The state and socialism actively hinder that civilizational progress through encouraging immediate consumption and otherwise inefficient activities, and will revert humanity's progress to valuing bare subsistence.
People are too affluent under capitalism. Bad times lead to strong men lead to good times lead to weak men, and weak men lead to bad times.
So here's that major flaw with linking affluence and high time preference behavior as described previously. It's the same thing. Capitalism discourages the development of bad men. Socialism encourages this development. And are those that constantly repeat this aphorism suggesting society be locked in a permanent state of bad times? I mean, what do the proponents of this view even suggest doing if this cycle is inevitable? And as far as affluence goes, how is that possibly bad? I feel no sympathy for the proponent of a view that actively advocates for stealing people's wealth and harming them for no reason other than they're too rich, by that person's standard.
I'm an economist, a statistician at heart.
Firms will cartelize.
Without the government to break them apart, firms are just going to collude with one another to set high prices, benefiting all firms at the expense of the consumers. So we need the government to come in and sometimes break these large cartels up, or stop them before they happen.
Alright, so cartels are a huge worry of anti-capitalists. For one, cartels are unstable. So the Bateman Company, Wayne Incorporated, and Sugar Company all sell weapons. As the free market society progresses, more people are going to own weapons, leading to a fall in demand. Currently, the market price for one firearm is $175. Wayne Incorporated's input costs, they estimate, are going to be higher than the future market price, so they realize they won't be able to stay open for long given the current market conditions. The heads of the company hatch a plan, talk with the heads of the Sugar and Bateman companies, and collude to raise the price of firearms to $200 apiece. The companies agree, and they restrict production and raise the prices of firearms. Time passes and one of two things occur. Either the decision to restrict production and raise prices was an efficient one, causing the companies to merge. This is merely cooperation. And here we return back to Benjamin Tucker, that the right to cooperate is as unquestionable as the right to compete. The right to compete involves the right to refrain from competition. Cooperation is often a method of competition, and competition is always, in the larger view, a method of cooperation. Each is a legitimate, orderly, non-invasive exercise of the individual will under the social law of equal liberty. Viewed in the light of these irrefutable propositions, the trust, then, like every other industrial combination endeavoring to do collectively nothing but what each member of the combination might fully endeavor to do individually, is, per se, an unimpeachable institution. To assail or control or deny this form of cooperation on the ground that it is itself a denial of competition is an absurdity. It is an absurdity because it proves too much. The trust is a denial of competition in no other sense than that in which competition itself is a denial of competition. The trust denies competition only by producing and selling more cheaply than those outside of the trust can produce and sell, but in that sense, every successful individual competitor also denies competition. The fact is that there is one denial of competition, which is the right of all, and that there is another denial of competition, which is the right of none. All of us, whether out of a trust or in it, have a right to deny competition by competing, but none of us, whether in a trust or out of it, have a right to deny competition by arbitrary decree, by interference with voluntary effort, by forcible suppression of initiative. It's possible, too, that the decision to restrict production and raise prices was an inefficient one, causing the companies to split apart and Wayne Incorporated to fail. In this scenario, the Chigurh and Bateman companies, the efficient firms, have incentive to leave Wayne Incorporated behind, able to tap into the market Wayne Incorporated was tapped into. The cartel is inherently unstable then, and will either lead to its breakup or a merger. And as Benjamin Tucker was saying, mergers are nothing more than cooperation. After all, in order to start a business, individuals merge their capital assets together. Are we to ban this activity? If not, at what point can capital stock no longer be combined? What about the dreaded one big cartel? What if every company colluded to form one big cartel? Well, first of all, the upper limit on this activity is the ECONOMISTS, which is usually used to debunk socialists, but it is also a constraint on how large a company can get. So essentially, firms must be able to refer to external markets to judge its own internal operations. A firm or a cartel that encapsulates every entrepreneur will be unable to make these judgments and will just fall apart immediately. Socialism is just one big cartel, except it is legitimized as the state, experiencing the evil, but held together through violently asserting itself over the populace. For this to take place, it must be legitimized by the passively accepting majority, but this gets into the anatomy of the state, which I won't get into as of this video. So, let's assume for a second the ECP works. Well, can the cartel exploit consumers? No, because consumers are going to pay as much of a price that they'll pay anyway. And now let's assume the cartel owns all land and capital. Can the cartel exploit laborers by agreeing to pay them a very low wage? No, as a cartel paying workers below their DMVP will give huge incentive to those within the cartel to break apart from it and give out higher wages and incentivize entrepreneurs outside of the cartel to compete with it. Laborers will also have incentive to start their own businesses or do other things altogether. There exist natural monopolies that will exploit people without the state to prevent them.
In some areas, a monopoly is necessary and will arrive inevitably on the market. When that monopoly arises, it will achieve a monopoly price. Additionally, the period in which competition exists before the monopoly comes about will be one of great inefficiency. Therefore, the government needs to immediately instate this monopoly and proceed to control its pricing so price gouging doesn't take place.
So this is a big neoclassical theory on barriers to entry. So first of all, the number of firms in a market is dictated by competition. The economists can't possibly make the claim that an industry is run at its most efficient so long as it has 7 firms, or 10 firms, or 15 firms, or 2 firms, or 1 firm. This claim is entirely beyond the economist and is decided by consumers in the marketplace. The claim that competition is inefficient in this area due to the falling average total cost curve is completely wrong. 2 kinds of defined periods for analysis can be focused on in terms of economics. There's the immediate run, which is the good is produced. What's the cost of the good? Well, it's 0. The previous costs are irrelevant. The producer's immediate goal is to sell the good for the highest price he can get, even if that price is below original cost. Because he spent $20 on some product, and then he goes to sell it and it turns out, oh, he can only sell it for $18, he's not going to keep it. So obviously this time period is irrelevant for natural monopoly since the average total cost is just 0. Or it's the long run, and in the long run or ERE, the input costs of goods are bid up to the price, erasing profits entirely. So what time period could this so-called natural monopoly theory be correct in then? Well, it's the arbitrarily defined short run. This theory consists of 2 parts, the average fixed costs and average variable costs. The proponents of this view argue that the fixed costs are very, very high, while the variable costs are very low, leading to falling average total costs over time. This theory is ridiculous because there's no such thing as a fixed cost apart from some arbitrarily defined period of time. The proponents of this view will look at you with a straight face and say that a firm, expecting a situation of no production to continue forever, will actively pay for fixed costs such as rent, management, etc. while producing nothing. Obviously, this isn't true. A business expecting zero output will sell their land, fire their management, etc. Further, the prices of certain inputs will be fixed so long as the proper period of time is frozen. As a result, natural monopoly theory falls by the wayside as another example of a poor excuse to involve the state in the interactions of private individuals. In order to get rid of competitors, large companies will set their prices below cost temporarily and then raise prices.
Well, in order to get rid of competitors, large companies with very large capital reserves, they're going to drop their prices so low that they make losses temporarily, while driving all of the businesses who can't afford the drastic price cuts out of the market. Then, they will achieve a monopoly price.
So, again, first of all, monopoly price is a myth. We've debunked it earlier. But to further address this claim, let's just say Logan Company is in business against a bunch of other firms. Logan, being a business with a fairly large amount of capital and reserves, drops the prices of his goods far below the market price, driving a bunch of competitors out of the market. After many businesses leave the market, Logan drastically hikes prices. This price hike attracts many more businesses looking to take advantage of the extra profits. Now, Logan is in the same situation and must radically drop prices again. Seeing the situation unfold, Brian, a different producer, decides to temporarily close his business during the price cuts and immediately reopen during the hikes, selling at market price, effectively bankrupting the Logan Company. Predatory pricing is yet another especially pervasive myth propagated by state parasites to justify the imposition of the state involuntary exchange. There are common goods that individuals can't pay for on their own.
Some valuable goods can't be funded individually because there is no benefit for one individual to contribute to its funding without the guarantee that everyone else who benefits from said goods will pay.
So this line of attack is used by people of all kinds, but I decided to address it here because it seems to be common among people who find themselves to be more economically oriented, say. So even if there did exist common goods that everyone in a group must pay for, there's no reason why these goods should be provided by one group, nor why everyone who used these goods need to be forced to pay. However, the people who argue this claim are well aware that not everyone will want to pay for these so-called common goods, so those who don't and receive benefits need to be forced to, reducing this problem to the second argument, the free rider problem, which I'll address after this. So first of all, what even is a common good? What goods are classified as common goods? Well, someone might say, well, the police are a common good because the police help everyone in the area that they protect, but a shoe store doesn't sell common goods because their establishment doesn't make everyone in the area have shoes. Except, there's no necessity for police to defend every person in an area, and especially no necessity for police to defend every person in an area equally. An absolute pacifist who hates police will be less happy because of the establishment of a police force. We can't just assume the establishment of police is of some benefit to every person or any other so-called common good. Someone else, this is Paul Samuelson, might say, collective goods are those which all enjoy in common in the sense that each individual's consumption of such a good leads to no subtraction from any other individual's consumption of that good. Basically, if a good is able to be used by me, but that use doesn't take away from your use, that good is a common good. First of all, this definition rules out all government services from roads to military defense, as their use as scarce resources necessarily detract from other people's use of them. Building a bunch of police stations in Ohio definitely detracts from the amount of police stations available in Wisconsin. If this definition is right, common goods aren't goods at all, but a natural condition of humanity, like air. Governments need not force anyone to fund these common goods, since they're available to all. The free rider problem.
People will not pay for goods that others buy, and will receive benefits without paying.
Well, first of all, everyone is a free rider on everything. Should people be punished for this? I mean, for example, all the technology that has been discovered and produced en masse is of great benefit to many people, yet we didn't partake in their production. Should we be forced to pay for this benefit? How much? If your neighbor gardens and you enjoy the sight that his garden provides, would it be right for your neighbor to call a group of armed men to force you to pay him the benefit of that garden? Everything humanity has gained has been inherited from the actions of those in the past. Is all of humanity to be taxed for these benefits? Who's going to get the money? Dead people? Say there's a group of terrorists in Nigeria who march around Africa with guns and force innocent Africans to pay them some amount of money every week. The residents of Nigeria get tired of this nuisance and proceed to march to their home and destroy it, decreasing incidences of terrorism throughout Africa. Would it be right for this group of residents, who've just destroyed this terrorist group, to go out with guns and force every citizen in Africa to give them penance for ridding Africa of this terrorist group? After all, the innocent civilians are benefiting off of their work. Have they not simply taken the place of the terrorist group at this point? This entire problem is a non-problem. It's an excuse to involve the state in personal affairs. If doing some action is too costly and the funds can't be raised in any way, there's certainly no way for the economist to say this is a beneficial thing to force people to pay, just as there's no way for the economist to claim a good should or should not be produced in any other manner. The network effect.
Companies that have been in the business for longer than other companies have an inherent advantage over them that has nothing to do with the quality of their product.
So this is also a non-problem, has a use. I've addressed monopoly price earlier, but we'll continue to go through this anyway. So this observation of inertia is nothing more than inertia. Sometimes older and established products may be more beneficial to continue using than newer and non-established products, like the buildup of trust, say. The allocation of factors is not instantaneous, since everything takes place in time. Additionally, the benefits of using older but worse products may be better in circumstances when switching would cause those older but still functional products to go to waste. For the economist to determine everyone switches to some new product or new company is another claim he cannot make. Take this scenario. Dice Incorporated has been producing steel for 30 years and has earned a name for itself as a result. People trust it. The Woods Corporation is a new firm that has been producing steel for only 3 months, but say it is much more cost efficient than Dice Incorporated. Because of its recent founding, the Woods Corporation doesn't have the trust that Dice Incorporated does. Are we to suggest that Dice Incorporated be forcefully shut down because the Woods Corporation is more cost efficient than Dice Incorporated? Haven't the consumers decided that they still prefer Dice Incorporated over the Woods Corporation because Dice Incorporated is more trustworthy as of this point in time? Further, if people choose to buy steel from Dice Incorporated, doesn't this illustrate that there is something preferable to people about Dice Incorporated over the Woods Corporation? If you say, sure, the Dice Incorporation is older, how do you know that this is the difference between the companies on a consumer level? How do you know people don't just prefer the steel from the Dice Incorporation for whatever reason? Maybe people prefer the CEO of Dice Incorporated over the Woods Corporation. Maybe the location of Dice Incorporated is more convenient than the location of the Woods Corporation. Which state agent is going to make the decision to shut down some company because of their belief about how people feel? Capitalism causes the business cycle.
As we can see from history, capitalism necessarily causes massive periods of success, followed by terrible periods of failure and unemployment.
Finally, I'm going to quickly address the business cycle. So essentially, the business cycle is the cause of fractional reserve banking and the Federal Reserve artificially setting interest rates. Now, this is a huge discussion to have, so if you want me to make a video on it, let me know. For now, go check out Tick's video called What Causes a Recession or Depression. The left is driven by egalitarianism. The center is led by propaganda instilled by the state elites. The right is driven by a goal of improving culture and fostering order, yet their own wants of a state contradict that goal. The economists are the state elite that propagandize the center, pushed by their need to artificially create a career for themselves. No matter if the arguments come from the left, the center, the right, or the economists, anti-capitalism doesn't hold up. At the end of the day, whether they're Marxists, Social Democrats, National Socialists, or Democratic Socialists, they're all just socialists. All of their claims are excuses designed to convince you that it's okay for them, the anti-capitalists, to enslave you. After all, it's for your own good. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.